So we've seen how we can use the ribbon to create variables, and we can use this variables pane down here to create variables as well. Now I'd like to focus on using a special activity called assign, and we'll see how using this activity allows us to be able to create new variables, but also to be able to assign different values to existing variables. To demo this, I'm going to connect my start to my sequence and double click on my sequence. This will just allow us to be able to run the robot and see some things happen. So I'll click and drag this assign activity into our sequence. If you look over here at the top right, you see that the only real controls we have are to and value. So here we have the option to right click and create a variable. Or we could type in the name of an existing variable if one exists. Notice down here we don't have any variables yet, so if I right click, I'll call my variable first name, and when I move away from that field, you can see the name of that variable shows up in my assign activity. And it also shows up down here in my variables tab. It was created as a generic value, and the scope is this sequence that is a parent to our assign activity. I'm going to change this to a string, and I'm going to open up some double quotes and set the first name value to Brian. When I click away from that, you can see that the default value was not set, but I have set the value of the first name variable to the string Brian. I'll type in message box and click and drag a message box into our sequence, and inside here I'll open up my double quotes and I'll type in first name holds the value colon space, and then I'll use the plus sign and type the name of my variable, and you can see the IntelliSense there shows up, so I can just hit tab and move away. So now when this robot runs, our flowchart will send us into the sequence. The sequence will create a variable, assign Brian to that variable, and then display a message box showing that name. So I'll run the robot, and sure enough, we're seeing exactly what we would expect. So that's how we can use the assign activity to create a new variable and assign a value to it. Let's say that inside this variables pane here, we create a new variable, and I'll just name it some number, and I'll set that to an int 32, and I'll leave the scope set to sequence. I'll set the default value of some number to 3 with no quotes, because this is an integer and not a string. And here I'll type some number is, and then we'll display the value of that variable. And notice that we're getting an error here because the robot can't automatically add this integer value to this string. So we have to use .toString to make this work. So you'll see here in the sequence, I'm not setting the value of some number. It's getting its value from the default here. So let's run it. As you would expect, some number is 3. So now let's take a look at how we can use the assign activity to assign a different value to that variable some number. So instead of right-clicking to create a new variable here, what I'll do instead is type in SOM, and you can see the IntelliSense shows us some number because it's an existing variable. So I'll hit tab to select that, and this time I'll supply the value of 5. So now the variable pane is where this variable gets created with a default of 3, but then our assign activity comes along and sets the value of 5 to it. Let's run the robot and see. So there you go, some number is 5. So you can see now that we can use the assign activity to create new variables or assign values to existing variables. Now it's important to realize that this doesn't have to be some simple assignment. You can type in any kind of a .NET expression here that you want to, as long as it makes sense for the variable type. So if I try to type in 5 here as a string, of course I'm going to get an error because I can't assign a string value to an integer variable. But I can do 5 plus 20 or any other sensible mathematical formula here. So when we run the robot now, you can see we get some number is 25, as expected. You can do the same thing with strings, and here I'm just putting in a space after my first name, and then a space in my last name. So now those two string values will be concatenated into one value for first name. And of course, if we change this to first name is, I can change that to first name, run the robot, and you can see our variable is now Brian Lamb. I have one too many spaces in there, but you get the idea. Do you think that we can assign one variable to another variable? Let's give it a try. I'll make a copy of some number. And of course, since some number is an integer, I can't assign that to my first name value because that's a string variable. But if I add on .toString here, now that's valid because I'm going to assign the value of 25 as a string to first name. So when I run the robot, we see first name is 25. So that's the basics of using the assign activity to create and set the value of variables.